Good morning. I'm Karen Tucker, CEO at the Churchill Club, and we appreciate you coming out to join us this morning. This program is called Fixing Leadership BS. We're privileged to have with us Jeff Pfeffer, who has spent a lot of time with this topic. In particular, it is the subject of his latest book entitled Leadership BS, Fixing Workplaces and Careers, One Truth at a Time, published in September of this year. We wish to thank Fenwick & West for generously hosting our event this morning. Thank you. It is the mission of the Churchill Club to inspire and encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. We strive to do this through unequaled programmatic excellence and the high quality of the audiences that we convene. We always respectfully ask our speakers not to pitch, but rather to add new insights and think of themselves as advancing collective knowledge, to equip people in the innovation community to recognize opportunities and also to meet the challenges ahead. We are a nonprofit organization, and of course we would appreciate you supporting us as a member or a donor. Our final program for the year will be held next week on December 9, called CIO Outlook 2016. We have the CIOs of Informatica, Symantec, Starbucks, actually she's CTO now, led in conversation by the CMO of Salesforce.com. And then our first program in the new year will be held on January 21st, featuring the co-founder and CEO of IEX, Brad Katsuyama, in conversation with Michael Lewis, the acclaimed best-selling author of books such as Flash Boys, of which Brad Katsuyama is the subject, as well as Moneyball, Liar's Poker, and others. If you tweet this morning, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, and you'll find other Twitter pointers in your programs. We are very excited to welcome back Jeff Pfeffer. Jeff is the Thomas D. II Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, where he has taught since 1979. He is the author or co-author of 14 books and is well known and respected the world over for his academic rigor and practical wisdom around topics such as power and leadership in organizations, evidence-based management, and the relationship between time and money, among others. Jeff has served on the board of directors of several human capital software companies, as well as other public and nonprofit boards. Please give a warm welcome to Jeff Pfeffer.
Thank you. It's nice to be back at the Churchill Club, and thank you all for coming out on a nice Friday morning to hear about leadership BS. I will try to make this topic less depressing than it often is. Many people say I'm depressing. I don't think it's depressing at all. So here's the story in a nutshell. I wrote this book because if you pay attention to life, which I think most of us do, you will notice that there's this wonderful, interesting discontinuity or juxtaposition. On the one hand, there is, and has been for decades, an enormous leadership industry. An industry of books, blogs, tweets, executive education, leadership industry providers, seminars, etc. The estimate of the size of this industry, McKinsey estimates it at $14 billion a year. That's 14 billion with a B, just in the United States annually. Barbara Kellerman of Harvard Business, not Harvard Business School, the Kennedy School, estimates it at $50 billion a year. Using some data from the American Society in Training and Development, I would estimate it to be about $20 billion a year. So it's a big industry, and it's existed for a long time. And this industry, of course, has, over the years, told leaders what they should do. And in the words of Lillian Cunningham, who runs the leadership section for the Washington Post magazine, the On Leadership kind of website column, she says, every day I get more leadership books, and that is probably correct, because I think there's more than one published per day, at least in the United States. And she says, every year, basically every day I get more leadership books, and you open up the books, and they all tell you the same thing. You need to be authentic. You need to tell the truth. You need to be modest, Jim Collins, level 5. You need to take care of others, Simon Sinek, leaders eat last, et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a long set of recommendations which have gone on for 50 or 60 or 70 years. This is a large industry. So that's kind of interesting. On the other hand, if you spend a nanosecond looking at any of the websites that will give you some insight into the condition of workplaces around the world or in the United States, you will find that the condition of workplaces around the world in the United States are horrible. Gallup, Worldwide Engagement Survey, 12% of people, according to Gallup's latest survey, 12% of people are engaged. 24% on the worldwide data are actively disengaged. Now, active disengagement, if you look at Gallup's definition, means, so there's engagement, disengagement, and active disengagement. Engagement means you're working hard and committed to the company. Disengaged means you're not doing much. Active disengagement means that you're sabotaging the workplace. So that means, that according to Gallup data, there are twice as many people sabotaging their employer than working hard on their behalf. If you don't like the Gallup data, you can look at Aon Hewitt or Towers Watson. They all have similar data. Employee engagement is low. Take the Conference Board. They have the longest running time series on job satisfaction, which has basically been on a linear trend down since 1987, the first time they did the survey. Well, maybe you say, who cares about employee engagement? Who cares actually about any of that stuff? Maybe we ought to worry about how well leaders are doing. Go to the Towers, Watson data, or Booz, which does a survey of this again, or the Conference Board, and you will find that leaders are losing their jobs at an increasing rate. And so leader tenure is going down. So not only is employee engagement going down and job satisfaction going down, leader tenure is going down. And maybe that isn't your favorite measure either. So you will say to me, well, give me another measure of workplace success. And so you can look at the surveys done by places like Development Dimensions International, DDI, or the Institute for Corporate Productivity, or any of these other organizations which go to companies, which, by the way, have an interest in saying that they're doing a great job, and say to the companies, how well are your own leadership development efforts going? A UK company did a survey. 8% of companies said we're doing great. 92% said we're doing terribly. So we are not doing well in terms of leadership tenure. We're doing horribly in terms of employee engagement, disengagement, turnover, job dissatisfaction. And the companies themselves will tell you, at least they tell the people who have done these surveys, which include McKinsey and a bunch of other people and a bunch of other companies, that their leadership development efforts are failing. So, and they're short of leaders, whatever. And then all you need to do is pick up the newspaper and or whatever your favorite media source is. I still actually read a newspaper, but most people, of course, don't anymore. And look at your favorite news source, and you can see the leadership blow-ups which are occurring on a daily basis. So this interested me. How could it be that on the one hand we were spending all this money and had all these intelligent human beings doing all this wonderful stuff, and trying so hard to build better leaders, and had done so for decades, and on the other hand, abject evidence of the abject failure of this industry. And by the way, the industry is quite. Of course, somebody the other day when I gave a version of this talk said the industry hasn't failed. I said, what do you mean it hasn't failed? He said, well, they collect $50 billion a year in revenue. So they're doing something right, which they actually are. So it depends upon how you define failure. If you define failure in terms of making organizations better, they failed. If you define failure in terms of not improving things so you can continue to deliver the same material over and over again, and get paid for doing it, they're doing quite well. So I became fascinated at this disjuncture. So that's one disjuncture that I want to spend a few minutes talking about, and then when we're done, we'll have plenty of time for questions. The other disjuncture, or the other discontinuity, is that when I give you the list of what leaders, the leadership industry tells you leaders should be, modest. Who exactly is leading in the Republican race? Modest. His name was on everything. As a matter of fact, that is how he has made his money, literally, by putting his name on everything. So his name is on golf courses, which he has no economic interest, except for the licensing fee for the use of his name. His name is on buildings, in which, by the way, he has almost no economic interest, except, again, for the use of his name. He's made a business out of his name. And Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, complained about Trump Tower in Chicago because he said the 200-foot high letters spelling out Trump were, of course, he said the building was gorgeous except for the letters. An aesthetic, whatever. Modesty. Modesty in short supply. What about authenticity? That's another one. My friend Bill George of Medtronic, who wrote the famous book True North, and has now written a new book called, I guess, Finding Your True North or something like that. Authenticity. One of the questions you might ask about authenticity is, number one, is it even possible? Because we all play, of course, a number of different roles in life. And so to be your authentic self, what does that mean? Is this your authentic self when you're 5? Or 15, or 25, or 50, because, of course, we evolve over time? Is this your authentic self in your role as a member of a family or a religious organization or a workplace? And which workplace and which role? And we understand that people respond to roles. But secondly, and more importantly, it's not clear to me that you actually want to be authentic to who you are. You want to be authentic to what the people around you need from you. And let me give you 2 quick examples that illustrate this. Number 1, the current dean, stepping down at the end of this year, probably to get a job as a provost or university president, is Allison Davis Blake. She's the dean of the business school at the Ross School at the University of Michigan, Allison Davis Blake. I like to say I knew Allison Davis Blake before she was hyphenated. I knew her when she was Allison Davis, a doctoral student at the Stanford Graduate School of Business who had made the mistake of having me as her advisor. If you had asked anybody who knew Allison Davis Blake as a young woman in her 20s to put her on a list of people who are likely to become a business school dean, there would be enormous consensus. However long that list was, she would have been last. Not because she wasn't smart, but because she was the most introverted human being that you would ever have encountered in your life. She claims, I don't remember this, but she claims this happened, that at the end of her first year in the program, we of course have evaluations of our students. And it is the job of the advisor to deliver the feedback to the student. So she said she came into my office and I said to her, I don't remember this, but she remembers it clearly. I said, Allison, everybody, of course, is quite impressed by your diligence and by how smart you are. But Allison, in order to succeed in academia, you need to speak. When are you going to speak? Now, if you think about being a dean or a university president or provost, and she is very high on some very prominent lists to get a very good job, the most important thing that university deans and presidents and provosts do is, in fact, speak. So for Allison Davis Blake to become the human being, the extremely successful, fabulous, wonderful, raised the largest gift in the history of the University of Michigan, $200 million, has done all kinds of amazing things. You can go to the University of Michigan website and see all that she's done. In order for her to do that, the one thing that I can tell you about Allison Davis is that she is not being true over her career to her essential introverted, unspeaking nature. In order for her to be successful, she had to become what the world required of her in that role. I'll give you another simpler example. When Gary Loveman, who's stepped down recently as CEO of Caesars, first came to speak in my class, because I wrote a case on him, because he's the most improbable success as a CEO in the history of the world, but in any event, when Gary came to my class in 2004, and I have a video of this, and I've showed this video to many people, and I ask people always the same question, how does Gary Loveman feel? Well, Gary Loveman's got energy, he's of course dynamic, he's engaging. He was also on that day running 101-degree temperature because he had the flu. For Gary, as a sentient human being, the last thing he wanted to do was be in front of 2 sections from 8 to noon. He wanted to be in bed. But as Gary will tell you, in those days, Harrah's, which is what Harrah's was called before it became Caesars, Harrah's had about 50,000 employees. And as Gary Loveman would tell you, many of these employees will see me once a year. And on that occasion when they see me, regardless of if my daughter's acting up, which she was at the time, regardless of what's going on, regardless of how I feel, regardless of anything about me, what they need from me is the signal, the sign that I have energy, that I'm committed, that I'm engaged, and if I feel like hell, doesn't matter. I can't be true to how I feel at the moment. I need to be true and authentic to what the human beings in this audience need from me. And that's exactly right. That's authenticity. Discontinuity there, too. What about telling the truth? That's my favorite. We all know there's an interesting discontinuity also. So you look at CEOs, I've been quoted, I think, as saying that the most important quality of a senior leader is the ability to lie with conviction, which of course is true. So, lying is kind of like, we shouldn't use the word lying. It's way too harsh. Let's use a different word. Strategic misrepresentation. Sounds much better. So, as you know, America's founding father, the father of our country is George Washington. And everybody in the room probably knows about the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, right? Little George chops down the cherry tree, confronted by his father. He says, I cannot tell a lie. I did chop down the tree. What many people in this room probably don't know, unless you've spent time on Wikipedia or rereading the history of this story, is that the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree is, of course, manufactured. It is not true. It was manufactured long after his death by a guy writing a book about leadership in the 1800s. And he said, I need an inspirational story. Why not? Let's make one up. It's oftentimes what we do. Fine. So, Parson Weems, Mason Locke Weems, wrote a book, made up the story. The story lives on. Politicians lie. I once said to somebody, except for his name one thing that Donald Trump has said that's actually accurate. It is not true that immigrants cause crime. It is not true, people, of course. My favorite example of this, 2011, it's about to happen again, maybe. In 2011, the government was headed for a shutdown because the Republicans refused to pass a continuing resolution because it included funding for Planned Parenthood. Senator John Kyle of Arizona stood up on the floor of the Senate and said, I refuse to pass a resolution for funding Planned Parenthood because, as we know, 90% or 95% of Planned Parenthood's money goes to funding abortions. The true number is 5%. This, of course, this discrepancy made immediately the Colbert Report and the Daily Show. The big media firestorm. How could Senator Kyle say these numbers, which of course weren't true? And in the book, Leadership BS, I actually quote the exact statement, but I'll give you a paraphrase of the exact statement. Senator Kyle's office, faced with this media firestorm, issued a press release that said Senator Kyle never intended his statement to be factual. You can't make this as my comedian friend Will Durst would say, you can't make this shit up. I mean, it is like, it's true. Now, so it's okay, well, that's politicians, you expect them to tell the truth. How about government officials? James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Mr. Clapper, does the National Security Agency collect information on the individual communications and telephone calls of individual citizens? Of course not. Then Edward Snowden releases it. Clapper gets called back. And he says, in the most convolutedly beautiful phraseology that I've ever seen, which I quote word for word in the book, but which I can't quite remember perfectly now, but it goes something to the effect of, well, I tried to get as close to the truth as I could without actually admitting what we were doing in the National Security Agency. Well, these are government officials. What do you expect? How about tobacco company executives? never had no knowledge that our companies had done research that showed the connection between smoking and cancer. How about auto company executives? This goes back 50, 60 years, unsafe at any speed. Ralph Nader begins with, companies covering up safety defects. But of course, we're in high technology. What about high technology? Read The Silicon Boys, David Kaplan's brilliant book on the history of the Silicon Valley. And in there is a chapter on, of course, Oracle. And in the chapter on Oracle, David Kaplan asks Ed Oakes, a co-founder of Oracle, with Larry Ellison, the following question. Does Larry lie? Because as we know in the software industry, there's actually a term for this. It's called vaporware. And we understand what vaporware is. Vaporware is, I'm selling you a product. Its availability is not quite what I've promised, and its features are not quite what it's promised. So in response to Ed Oakes' question, does Larry lie? In response to David Kaplan's question to Ed Oakes, does Larry lie? The response is, we prefer to say that Larry has a problem with tenses. As in, the product is available means now that you've asked me about it, we'll think about designing it. And then, of course, the phrase reality distortion field. A phrase that everybody in this room knows came out of Andy Hartsfield, who worked with Steve Jobs on the original Macintosh product. And Steve Jobs, of course, illustrates the power of the effective lie. If you tell it, it can become self-fulfilling. Absolutely. So, by the way, there's social science research on lying. The average human being lies twice a day. Lies are often done to smooth over social relationships. The correct answer when your partner says to you, does this outfit make me look fat, honey? The correct answer is no. Do you love me as much as when I first met you 30 years ago? The correct answer is yes. We strategically misrepresent. Anybody in this room who's bought a house or sold a house has not necessarily told the counterparty exactly what they are doing and exactly what their reservation price is. Anybody in this room who's engaged in the sales process has probably, to some extent, because there's data on this as well, misrepresented their own product's qualities and maybe the qualities of their other product, of the competitors' products. That's interesting as well. So there's this wonderful discontinuity between what we claim we want in leaders and what leaders actually do, which is, of course, one of the interesting issues, and we'll come to what that all means in a nanosecond. There's a discontinuity between the amount of money we spend on leadership and what we get. So let me give you a few kind of practical suggestions, and we could go through more things like trust and taking care of others and all this other stuff, but we've given you 3 examples. We can save the other examples for later. So what is the problem? There are many problems. The first problem is that when you ask how are leadership talks evaluated, how is the leadership development efforts evaluated? If you actually go and look at what companies do, you will find they do one of 3 things. Number 1, many do nothing. Number 2, some of them will evaluate based upon how much money we've spent. So I know people in the chief learning officer business who say, we've had a good year. We've spent N million dollars and put so many people through these programs. And number 3, when they do evaluations at all, they will almost invariably use what has been come to call in the trade happy sheets or smiley face sheets. Did you have a good time? Now, we don't know about this in the leadership literature, but there is a lot of research on the following question. What is the correlation between teacher evaluations and objective measures of learning? which began actually in 1974. In a wonderful thing, there was a calculus class. Everybody in the class at the end got the same exam, but they all had different discussion sections. You know, a huge lecture hall. Remember those days, thousands of years ago? Huge lecture hall. People went off into discussion sections with different TAs. So you could say, what is the relationship between the TA evaluation and performance on the test? And over the years, the designs have become more sophisticated. To make a very long story short, the relationship between measures of instructive evaluation and objective measures of learning is precisely 0. And the better the measure of learning, the closer to 0 the relationship is. And that's for a simple reason. Most of us want to be entertained, but learning is the opposite of entertainment. Learning is actually the opposite of entertainment. Because if I really want you to learn something, what I probably need to do is make you modestly uncomfortable. You have to have a little creative tension. You have to say, I need to think differently about something. And most people don't want to think differently. So, first problem, we're using the wrong measures of evaluation. Second problem. There are lists. People say to me, who are the greatest leadership experts? And there are lists. I did a Google search. Greatest leadership experts. And there's now 2 lists. I haven't gotten around to looking at the second list. First list came up was Inc. Magazine 2014. Greatest leadership experts. So I look at the list. This is an interesting list. Some of these people I've never heard of. So I decided to do a bio. You know, everybody is Google. Nobody's private anymore. Let's go find out something about these human beings. So I took the top 20 and asked the following simple question. Of the top 20 leadership experts, according to Inc. Magazine's list, how many of them have what any human being, I think, would modestly consider to be relevant credentials? Like, is there any evidence that they've been trained in anything related to the social science on leadership? And the answer is 5 out of 20. That's pretty good. Number 1 on the list was trained in actually the most useful skill if you're actually going to be a leadership speaker in today's world. PhD in theology. Theology, of course. The leadership industry is mostly about lay preaching. It is about telling people inspiring stories in very articulate ways that make them feel good. Doesn't bear much resemblance to the world outside our windows, but it's a kind of a nice, inspiring thing to do. So actually 2 of the top 20 have degrees in theology. One, of course, has no degree at all. And then you go to their websites and see what is their self-proclaimed expertise. And the self-proclaimed expertise to be a success in the leadership industry is, of course, talking. Talking. So my word of advice to you is, number 1, don't get old. So on July 7th in 2014, I had to have back surgery. In the words of my wife, he must be a good back surgeon. He has no personality. I'll give you his name. He's one of the top 20 neurosurgeons in the country. He practices in San Francisco, if you want. You go to Yelp, you see complaints about his office furniture. I'm not making this up. You know, somebody's doing microsurgery on my back. I want to know only one thing. Do they know what the hell they're doing? This is not about, does he have a Twitter account? Which, by the way, he does not. This is not about whether or not he's on LinkedIn, which, by the way, he's not. This is not about whether or not he is articulate, charming. Does he have a relevant degree? And in his billions of years of practice, has he ever had one complication? The answer to that, by the way, is no. Yes, wow, that's exactly right. He's like the man. Trust me. We spent a long time finding him. It's hard to get into also, but at any event. In the leadership industry, have we looked for relevant credentials? Have we looked for people who know anything? Or have we looked for people who provide great entertainment? By the way, the problem is not the people providing the entertainment. The problem is with the people who buy the entertainment. The market delivers what you want. You want entertainment? The leadership industry deliver great entertainment. I mean, I have heard many of these wonderful people speak. You know, bring tears to your eyes. I mean, they are amazing. They are engaging. They are articulate. They are charming. They are thousands of things. But you need to ask a question: is what are they saying comport in any way with reality? And the answer to that is oftentimes, of course, no. So we ought to hire relevant expertise. We ought to evaluate people and evaluate our leadership experiences based upon some criteria that are related to employee engagement or the tenure of leaders or whether or not we have a leadership shortage. In other words, we ought to measure what matters rather than something which is either orthogonal to or maybe even negatively correlated with what matters. That's the second thing we ought to do. And the third thing we ought to do is stop confusing what we would like to be with what is. It would be nice if leaders took care of other people, the people for whom they are responsible, as they do oftentimes in the military. It would be wonderful. But in a world in which the ratio between CEO compensation and average pay is getting larger and larger every year, the audacity of writing a book entitled Leaders Eat Last, as opposed to maybe Leaders Should Eat Last, different book. The idea that leaders eat last, I don't think so. I mean, I don't see any evidence of that. To take another example from the Silicon Valley, when Carly Fiorina lost her job at Hewlett-Packard, and they offered her the $20 million plus the other $20 million, or $41 million to leave, I did not see Carly say, by the way, during my tenure we've laid off I don't know how many tens of thousands of people. I'll take the $41 million and help make their economic lives whole. I don't think so. When Stan O'Neill in 2007 took Merrill Lynch into oblivion, by the way, subsequent to taking Merrill Lynch into oblivion, he was put on the board of directors of Alcoa, which is the next thing we're going to talk about, the absence of consequences for bad behavior or for failure. Stan O'Neill did not say, I'm going to take the $140 million severance that he walked away with and distribute it among, in any way or any portion of it, among the thousands of people or, tens of thousands of Merrill Lynch employees who had lost money and jobs in the economic catastrophe of the meltdown and the forced sale of Merrill Lynch. So we have confused with what should be with what is, and that's a very dangerous confusion. Because if you say, I would like leaders to tell the truth, I would like leaders to take care of other people, I would like leaders to possibly be more authentic, that we can debate about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I would like leaders to be modest or any of these other wonderful qualities. In order to build those qualities and a set of leaders, you have to understand two things, neither of which we've done a very good job understanding. Number one, you have to understand precisely how you would measure authenticity, taking care of others, or whatever. It's one of the reasons why medicine is doing much better than leadership. I mean, medicine understands how to measure very precisely hand washing, other kinds of practices that would keep people healthy, etc. Number one, you need to know where you're going, what you're trying to achieve. Number two, you need to understand where you are and why you are there. So, we understand perfectly well how to change behavior. And the way to change behavior is not telling people inspirational stories. You want to lose weight, you want to stop smoking, you want to stop drinking, you want to stop fooling around, or maybe you want to start all those things. We do know how to change your behavior. We understand, according to an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine, that obesity travels through social networks, that you are much more likely to smoke if your friends smoke, that you're much more likely to drink if your friends drink, that you're much more likely to take drugs if your friends take drugs. We are influenced by our social environments. We know that. You want to change your behavior? Change the people that you're surrounded by and their behavior. We also understand the power of social cues. and the power of visual cues. So Brian Wansink, used to teach at Stanford, now teaches at Cornell, famous marketing professor, has made a fabulous career over writing things for the diet industry. It turns out if you serve people food on smaller dishes, they eat less. By the way, if you serve people drinks in glasses that make the liquor look more, which the bars have learned a long time ago, they will drink less. We're cued by our environment. This is not about inspiration. Nobody's ever, changed their behavior because they went through some inspiring talk, because they leave. And 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, if they're lucky later, the talk is a lovely memory. And they are surrounded by the visual cues and the social relationships and the things that, of course, are directing and producing their behavior. So we want to actually produce people who behave differently. We need to change the consequences. And I will end my talk with one final interesting statistic. As you see, I'm kind of an academic, which I actually thought was first time somebody called me an academic, I said thank you. I didn't understand it was an insult, but in any event, it's fine. There are few consequences in this society for bad behavior, for really bad behavior. There was a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research that asked the following question: what happened to directors on banks that had to take government help? Did they lose their directorship positions? The answer to that is yes, though not at a rate significantly different from people who had been directors of banks that did not have to take money from the government. I give in the book examples of people from AIG. You all remember AIG? Who got put on boards, senior executives from AIG who got put on boards after AIG failed. Stan O'Neill, my favorite example, put on the board of Alcoa after the Merrill Lynch experience. Alcoa says, when asked why they put Stan O'Neill on their board, they said, we wanted someone who was an expert in financial crises. You help cause it, you're an expert in it. It's kind of like, So we have an interesting relationship with respect to people and the consequences of their actions. So I write a column for Fortune, bi-monthly, irregularly bi-monthly, but on average about twice a month. I write some column for Fortune online. And one of my columns was about the Amazon thing, the article which talked about the bad Amazon culture. And that caused me to be interested in the following question. What is the overlap between companies on the most admired list and the best places to work list? 4. There are 4 companies on both lists. We live in a world in which if you are rich enough and successful enough, your behavior will be excused, both as a company and as a human being, which is interesting. It's one of the reasons why we live in the world that we live in, because it turns out if you're rich enough, it's all okay. It is all okay. It isn't all okay, as you can tell, in my opinion, but it's all okay in the society because and there are a variety of mechanisms we should go into it. So how that becomes okay, one of the mechanisms is we can't stand inconsistent thoughts. It's the principle of cognitive dissonance. And we cannot stand so we don't like discrepant thoughts in our head at the same time. One thought, this is a very successful company. Other thought, this is a company that's killing people. Bad. So we better find excuses for the bad behavior, which we do all the time. So it is possible to change workplaces and leaders and careers one truth at a time, but you have to begin by acknowledging the empirical realities. You have to, secondly, begin with a very good understanding of what we are trying to achieve and why. And we need particularly to begin with a very good understanding of why the world is the way it is and what the forces are that are producing all of these things. And then we might begin to work on them. But if we continue to tell ourselves inspirational stories that mostly aren't true, I could also have a whole section, which I don't want to do because my boss here has signaled to me that we're about out of time. I could also tell you all kinds of stories as to why the stories that people tell you about their own careers are almost invariably not true. Almost because they can't be. Number one, people like to self-enhance. But number two, as we know from extensive research on eyewitness accounts of both accidents and crimes, a memory is fallible. So even if there is no motive to lie or to have biased recall is imperfect. We know this. I mean, there's an extensive literature which any trial lawyer can tell you about how even when people have no incentive to distort what they remember, they have every incentive to say, I saw this accident, this is to the best of my recollection what I saw, it's inaccurate. And finally, as Ben Dolnick, of course, has pointed out in this brilliant article in the essay in the New York Times, if you tell a story often enough, it's exactly, of course, not only do you believe it, you can no longer distinguish the story that you've told yourself that often from the story that you made up. That's exactly correct. And there's evidence for that as well. So, if we are going to create a different world which has higher levels of employee engagement, as a different world that is better in the future than in the past, I'm not exactly sure how to do it, but I can tell you how not to do it. And how not to do it is to continue telling ourselves the same stories over and over again with the same kind of repetition of leaders ought to be. Leaders ought to be many things. We need to understand why they're not. And we need particularly to understand and acknowledge and to take responsibility for our individual, corporate, and collective responsibility for producing the behaviors that we then say we don't like. So people say, I don't like politicians who lie. To which I say, stop voting for them. I don't like CEOs who abuse their workforces. Stop putting them on the most admired lists. It's not actually that hard. Are we out of time? Yes, perfect. Time for questions, if you can. I don't call on you, they call on you. I've been trying to, follow the rules here. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Erin. I have been noticing more dialogue on social media about holacracy. And so one approach companies are taking is let's get away from the traditional leadership model. I'm just wondering if you've seen any evidence whether those kinds of programs are working.
Okay, thank you. It's a great question. So certainly one recommendation and one sensible thing to do would be to say, in a world in which we have a bunch of bad leaders behaving badly, let's build less leader-centric organizations. And there are several ways to do that. We'll come back to holacracy in a nanosecond. One way to do that is to build organizations in which people elect their leaders. There are such things. They're called partnerships. So at Fenwick and West, and in most law firms that I know, there is some form of representative democracy, or semi-quasi-representative democracy, in which at least the partners elect their fellow partners. That would make a less leader-centric organization that has more accountability to the human beings in the organization. A second way to do that would be to build a less leader-centric organization would be to have some kind of worker co-op, like Mondragon or the John Edwards Partnership in the United Kingdom. A third way to do this would be to build an organization which has countervailing power to the leader, and that would be like you see in Germany with the works councils or some kind of union representation, but unions, of course, are gone in the United States. Another way to do this would be, in theory, through holacracy. Problem with holacracy is that it presumes something which I think is empirically been demonstrated to not be true, which is that, I have a colleague named Laura Tiedens, and Laura Tiedens will tell you that if you put people in groups and you say to them, you have to accomplish some task they will almost invariably organize themselves into a hierarchy. So hierarchy, when you look at almost every living system, including even fish, let alone, things with brains like us, almost everything is organized hierarchically. And Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize and is now deceased, wrote a famous book called The Architecture of Complexity, and talks about how the only thing that makes complex systems possible is, in fact, concatenations of hierarchical arrangements. So holacracies tend not to be relatively stable. So I, by the way, find it interesting that Tony Hsieh has put in holacracy through autocracy. In other words, Tony says you will be there, and as you know, almost 20% of the people in Zappos left because they didn't like it because this is so it's kind of an interesting idea, the kind of a contradiction in terms. So but holding that aside, I don't think they're, particularly stable organizations. People, we claim we don't want hierarchy, but if you actually look at how we organize ourselves, even when there's no reason to do so, we tend to organize ourselves pretty hierarchically. But the premise of your question, I think, is exactly correct. If one of the ways to build organizations which are less prone to be screwed up by bad leaders is to build less leader-centric organizations. And I think that premise, is exactly right. Whether holacracy is the best way to do it, whole nother issue. I saw many hands up, and there are fewer now, but anyway.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. Patrick Dempsey from Lawrence Livermore Lab. My question is, what is the right measure for effectiveness of a leader, and who does this? Who measures that?
Wow. So I love talking at the Churchill Club. The audience is smarter than the speaker. So I think that question raises two really important points, at least. One is that, so I was having lunch with a friend of mine. I do have a few. And he said, I read a draft of your book. He said, tell me what I need to do to be a better leader. And I said, but by what criteria? And the problem is that the criteria for individual well-being and organizational well-being are not necessarily perfectly correlated. And in fact, sociobiology would tell you that they're negatively correlated. So what's good for you as an individual, if we roll a live hand grenade from which the pin has been pulled into this room, what is good for the group is for you to throw your body on the hand grenade. It's not so good for you. That's an extreme example. So, when people say, was Stan O'Neill a successful executive at Merrill Lynch? I will say he left with $140 million. By some criteria, he was extremely successful. If you're a Merrill Lynch employee, you're not so happy because the company got itself into big financial difficulty. So one of the things that you will notice, and if you are a sentient human being, which everybody in this room is more than sentient, is that the correlation between CEO compensation and economic well-being and the welfare of the companies that they manage is far from one. As a matter of fact, there's a big controversy as to whether how much of CEO compensation is actually related to corporate performance at all. But that would be an interesting example. So there are CEOs who have done terribly, who have gotten fired, who've left with huge sums of money, and other CEOs, so there's all kinds of things. So number one, you got the issue of better leader for whom? Better leader for me, better leader for the organization. Number two, even within, I want to do better for the organization. What does that mean? Does it mean profits? Over what period of time? Measured how? Does it mean economic? Does it mean social well-being? Does it mean environmental performance? Does it mean, I and two colleagues, I'm writing a new book. I'm always writing new books. It's one of the things I do because I'm an academic. Title of my new book is called Dying for a Paycheck. The two colleagues in operations research and I have done some amazing, they did most of the work, some amazing research to demonstrate that many workplace practices, which are quite common in the work environment, are as harmful for you as secondhand smoke. And that there are 120,000 excess deaths conservatively in the United States each year from workplace exposures. And I'm not talking about chemicals. We're talking about stress. We're talking about long work hours, absence of job control, economic insecurity. So, if you are Gallup, and I happen to be some senior research fellow of Gallup, which, by the way, means nothing, but I like Gallup, they like me. That's basically what it means. You look at Gallup. Gallup has partnered with Healthways to do a well-being index. Gallup puts out reports on what is a good job. And their definition of a good job means, by the way, that you support yourself, and that you're engaged with your work. So I happen to believe that human well-being ought to be a higher priority as we think about, organizational success and what makes a place a great place and what makes a leader a great leader. But that is not necessarily going to be perfectly correlated with the economic. So you've asked a fabulous question, which requires us to do something that I think we don't do, which is set priorities. So people say, I'm going to tell you how to be a great leader. If anybody tells you how to be a great leader, stop listening right there. Because in order to tell you how to be a great leader, I need to be way more precise about how are we going to measure that, and along what dimensions are we going to measure that.
Thank you for asking wonderful questions. My business for the last 50 years has been analytical chemistry, in which I was tasked with measuring things that were unmeasurable. So developing ways to measure stuff has been my business for 50 years. Right now, we have the science of econometrics, which is questionable. We have psychometrics, which can be useful. And to my knowledge, we're not using either of these in measuring leaders or measuring business.
That's correct.
Right? My sense of this is the reason we're not using this is they're not the direction and goals of the leaders. So what I'm interested in, acknowledging up front that all of the money that comes into a business comes from our customers. So customer satisfaction needs to be a focus.
Yep.
And essentially all of our profit comes from the productivity of our people. So that needs to be something we're focusing on. And I look forward to moving in the direction of being able to focus on these two things.
Yes, that would be nice.
I think the problem in business is we're focusing on something else.
Yes, that's correct.
And the danger of me actually talking about this is the same thing that H.G. Wells ran into when he started to talk about important stuff. He got beaten about the Head and Shoulders, and he wrote The Country of the Blind, a nice short story that illustrated that when you see what's going on, you can get into a lot of trouble.
You've described the story of my career. You've described nicely the story of my career. I had the privilege of knowing and meeting the famous Peter Drucker when he was, of course, still alive. And Peter Drucker said, he gave me two compliments. He said, "You're not very academic for an academic," which he intended as a compliment. I took it as such. The other thing he said, business is pretty simple. There's no business without a customer. If you take care of your customers, you will have a business. And if you don't, you won't. But by the way, that turns out not to be true, because there are ways to succeed without being very customer-centric, and it's called building a monopoly. So I wrote one of my famous columns. I'm going to write a new column about why AT&T is worse than Comcast. But I wrote a column about if you look, the telecommunications companies telecommunications, internet, cell phones are the 3 lowest rated industries on the American Customer Satisfaction Index published out of the University of Michigan. And the reason why they can mint money is because if you live, as I do, in Hillsborough, California, you have one choice for internet provider. It's called Comcast. You have one choice if you want a landline, which is called AT&T. And AT&T, by the way, will almost admit to you that they don't maintain their landline infrastructure. And Comcast will almost admit to you that they don't, spend any money on anything other than advertising, or take the airlines. We now have all these fortress hubs. You're going to fly out of Minneapolis. You're going to fly Delta. Delta could be good. Delta could be bad. It's going to be Delta. You're going to fly out of Newark. It's going to be United. So there is a way to succeed without pleasing the customers or the employees, and it's unfortunately a way that our public policy has made all too possible, which is you give people monopolies. The drug companies, of course. AT&T has basically reconstituted itself after the antitrust breakup, and the drug companies now, have done all these amazing things, which I'm sure you're reading about, how you basically buy companies and then you raise the price of the pills, even if they're generics, let alone if they're not generics. So there is a way to make money without taking care of your employees or the customers, but it's probably not a good way. Are we out of time? I'm seeing you on the edge of your seat. 5 minutes to end. Okay. So somebody's keeping time here.
Thank you. Arvid, you said if you're only successful enough, bad behavior would be excused. And I also see that, and I've also sensed this in many years watching high top executives' careers. So to me, it comes at the end to the question, what is considered success, and how does a society value what is success? So now one step to maybe our environment here. We see that some of the leaders here who've been very successful start speaking about different things that they value most than just profit. Let's take the big ones who really start spending lots of their private resources to do other things, help society, make programs for technology proliferation, and so on. Yes. I'm not talking about the tax effect that might be also involved, but do you see a chance with this new aspects, these new ideas like Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Mark Zuckerberg, investing their private property in these things? Is it really a chance for change, or do you think it's just a different type of, at the end, ending up being a bad behavior?
That's a fabulous question. There is a talk given by somebody whose name has just escaped me, but it's a fabulous talk. It's very famous. Somebody in this room will have heard of it. It's the guy who gave the talk at the Aspen Institute, which is now all over the web. So this guy, and I wish I could remember his name, but maybe you can find it from famous talk on the Aspen Institute or some Google search or something. So this guy is and I think he's writing a book. He's a young guy, not from the U.S., who went to the Aspen Institute as an Aspen Institute fellow thing at the Aspen conference or whatever. And he said, I'm standing in a room named after all these famous people, and I got all these famous people giving money to the Aspen Institute. And he argued, and I'm not sure I agree with this, but it's an interesting argument. He argued that what had happened is that people had made their fortunes, Carnegie, Ford, the current people actually also, in many cases, doing things that were not necessarily so nice, and that having now made all this money, they were going to give some portion of it, or maybe even all of it, away as a way of, particularly as you get towards the end of your life, trying to buy your way in or whatever. Whatever. The Catholic Church sold indulgences for many years, as we know. This is kind of, religion will sell salvation. Everything is for sale. And his argument was, and it's a brilliantly articulate speech, and I wish I could remember his name. It's a brilliant articulate speech, which is available, the whole speech is available everywhere. And it's got all kinds of play. And he said, maybe, instead of first making money, and then figuring out how to redress the harm that you have done in the process of making the money, you ought to be a little more preventive on the way up. In other words, instead of saying, okay, we've polluted the world, and we've, screwed our employees and laid off, zillions of people and done all this other stuff. And now, having made our fortune, we're now going to figure out a way to try to redress some of the harm that we have done. Maybe we ought to try to do something along the way to not do the damage as we are building the enterprises. And that's an interesting point of view, and it's one that I actually kind of agree with. So I still remember, one final quick story, I still remember kind of approximately 1 billion years ago, because it was a long time ago when they still had auto plants in California other than Tesla, when General Motors have got a big publicity for giving, 20 or 30 or 40 or $50 million for economic development in the city of Los Angeles. Around the same time, they were closing their Van Nuys plant. And there was a time, I don't know, this is a true fact, because it was told to me by somebody who I believe, who came from Michigan to Berkeley. At one point, approximately 25% of the black the African American middle class worked in the auto industry. This was an enormous source of wealth. The Van Nuys auto plant employed 5,000 or 6,000 people at, in the old days, unionized auto industry wages. So you're talking about significant money in the economy. And I still remember, because somehow this came up in a class that I was teaching, guy raised his hand and he said, he's Hispanic. He said, I'm from that section of Los Angeles. And he said, General Motors could get $50 million a year for 100 years, and it will not make up for the economic devastation that has been caused by losing 5,000 or 6,000, I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 well-paid middle-class jobs with health insurance and pensions and all the other stuff. The economic devastation. And these, by the way, people working in the auto plants are not Silicon Valley engineers. So when you lose your job in a General Motors auto plant, you're not going to go work for Google. I mean, your economic mobility is way down. You're going to be at Walmart or someplace. So he sees the economic devastation. And so it's a fabulous question, because it causes us to think about, the consequences of what we're doing. And the consequences of the jobs we're creating. And when you look at Gallup has this, the nice thing about Gallup, I love Gallup. No wonder they love me. They have a thing on jobs, and they measure job quality. And it turns out job quality is not whether or not you work for yourself, because the highest percentage of people who work for themselves are in countries like Bangladesh, because they're selling trinkets. These are, in quotes, entrepreneurs. Not necessarily how you define an entrepreneur, but they're entrepreneurs. They are self-employed, selling trinkets on the street, making maybe $50 a year or something. So to them, the Gallup, a good job is, do you have a job where you make sufficient money? Not are you driving for Uber at $9 a day or whatever the average Uber driver gets when you factor out whatever. So what fabulous questions. So if we could only answer them all, we'd be fine. We're done? We're done.
I'll come up.
My boss has told me we're done. Thank you so much.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. As a convenience to you and courtesy of Books, Inc., Jeff's book, Leadership BS, is available for sale as you walk out, and Jeff has very graciously agreed to stick around, answer a few more questions, and personalize your book copy should you wish. A recording of this program will be posted on our YouTube channel within a day or so, I hope. There you will find recordings of most of our other programs as well, which we hope you will continue to find to be a useful resource. And you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and see you next time.